There's a particular kind of silence that happens when a room realizes it's made a mistake. Not the polite kind, not the awkward kind where someone mispronounces a word and clears their throat and moves on. The weight-bearing kind. The kind where the air pressure actually changes. Where grown men suddenly find the floor extremely interesting and the clock on the wall becomes the most important object in human history. I've heard that silence in 3 countries. I've heard it in a firebase outside Kandahar when our CO realized the map he'd been trusting for 6 days was printed with a 2-kilometer error. I've heard it in a forward operating base in the Korengal when a staff sergeant, 12 years of service, chest full of ribbons, got dressed down in front of his squad by a woman who hadn't slept in 41 hours and still spoke in the kind of measured, unhurried sentences that make you understand, on a cellular level, that she has already war-gamed every version of this conversation and she is letting you catch up. And I heard it in a gun store in Clarksville, Tennessee on a Tuesday afternoon in October when a boy behind a counter, 22 at most, jaw still deciding what kind of face it wanted to grow into, looked at a 63-year-old woman in civilian clothes buying ammunition and said, "You sure you don't need me to show you how those work, sweetheart?" He was smiling when he said it. The kind of smile that's never been earned. The kind that gets handed out free at birth to boys who've never been in a room where the stakes were real. She didn't answer him. She was still setting her card on the counter when the front door opened, the bell above it chimed, and a man in a suit that cost more than that kid's monthly wage took 3 steps inside, stopped, and said her name. Not her first name, her rank, and then added, "Ma'am," like punctuation. Like punctuation. The boy behind the counter opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There are things that happen in combat that restructure you. Rearrange the furniture inside your chest so that nothing is ever quite where you left it. I've tried to explain this to people who weren't there, and watch their eyes go polite and distant, the way eyes do when they're loading a different thought behind a nod. You can't explain it. You can only show the evidence. And the woman at the counter had 31 years of evidence. This is how some of it was made. The log I started keeping in the Korengal has 214 entries. Entry 112 reads, 13:42 hours. Bravo element pinned, eastern ridgeline. Holloway called the egress route. Wrong. Everyone knows. Nobody says. Nobody said because Holloway had been there 11 months, and his boots had more mileage than most of us had service years. And in that particular calculus, the one that runs on testosterone and proximity to danger, mileage counted more than being right. We lost 22 minutes to that mistake. In that valley, 22 minutes was the kind of time that compounds interest. I write things down because I stopped trusting my memory under stress. It bloats. It edits. It makes the decisions I made sound more reasonable than they were, sands the ugly corners off the choices, hands me back a version of events I can sleep with. The log doesn't do that. The log is just numbers and names and the particular shame of seeing it all reduced to timestamps. Entry 147. Sergeant Major Eleanor Voss attached to Bravo Company. No introduction given, no briefing requested. She arrived and stood at the edge of the map table and looked at the terrain overlay like she'd already been there. That was the first time I saw her. She was 59 years old. I know that because I looked it up. Not out of respect, out of something closer to disbelief, the involuntary Wikipedia search impulse that fires when your brain can't make the categories fit. She didn't look 59 the way a civilian looks 59, the softness, the negotiated peace between a body and its own gravity. She looked 59 the way a particular type of gear looks well used, tighter than new, more trustworthy for it. Captain Dill saw her first and made a face. I logged the face. Entry 147, subsection CO expression, calculating. Like a man holding a hand he doesn't know how to play. The firefight that put Voss in my log permanently didn't start with gunfire. It started with a sound I still can't categorize. On halfway between a cough and a crack, A sound that didn't belong to any equipment in our inventory and didn't match the ambient noise profile of a mountainside at 0300 hours, which I'd spent 6 weeks memorizing whether I meant to or not. Wind patterns, animal movement, the specific tenor of silence that precedes something bad. That sound preceded something bad. Voss heard it first. I know because I was standing 8 feet from her when it happened, nursing my 4th cup of the cold, gritty, aggressively unpleasant coffee that somehow accumulated at the bottom of every thermos in the firebase like sediment, and she turned her head before the second crack came. Not toward the sound, away from it. 45 degrees southwest, already locating the secondary position. I still think about that. The first instinct is to look at the threat. Every training simulation, every FTX, every replicated ambush scenario hammers that reflex in until it's brickwork. Identify, locate, respond. But she turned away, which meant she'd already triangulated, already read the geography, already made a decision about where she needed to be before the rest of us had finished processing that there was a problem. 11 seconds later, incoming rounds hit the position where she'd been standing. I wrote it down. What followed I can only describe in the order I experienced it, which is not the order in which it actually happened. Combat is not sequential. It's a deck of cards thrown in the air, and your job is to catch the right ones before they hit the ground. And nobody's ever quite sure which ones are right until it's over, and some of them have already buried themselves in the dirt. Dill was calling grid coordinates that were 17 meters off. I could hear it in his voice. The specific pitch a man's voice hits when he's running on adrenaline and false certainty. When the map in his head has stopped matching the ground under his boots, but he hasn't registered the discrepancy yet because his body is moving too fast for the update to land. Martinez was down, not dead leg, messy, and Holbrook was trying to work on him and shoot at the same time, which is the kind of multitasking that looks heroic in retrospect and feels like absolute disintegrating chaos from inside it. Voss was on the radio. She was using a voice I hadn't heard from her before. A lower than her normal register, stripped of everything except information. No affect, no urgency, just clean data delivered with the efficiency of a machine that had been doing this specific thing for so long, it no longer needed to perform competence because competence was just what it was. Negative on that grid. Adjust 20 meters north-northeast. Confirm. Dill started to argue. She didn't let him finish. Not loud. She didn't get loud. She just kept talking. I kept giving the corrected coordinates in that scraped clean voice, and what I understood in that moment, the understanding arriving like cold water rather than revelation, was that she wasn't arguing with Dill. She was simply continuing. As if his objection was atmospheric, as if the mountain and the incoming fire and the bleeding man on the ground were more real than whatever authority structure Dill was trying to invoke. The adjusted fire came in. Correct. And Dill didn't say anything for a long time after that. I logged it. 1-47-C, Voss overrode CO grid call. Correct adjustment, 14-second response window. Dill silent. There's a moment in extended contact. I've heard other people describe it, so I know it's not mine alone. Where fear stops being an acute thing and becomes background radiation. Your hands stop shaking and become very precise. Your vision narrows but goes deeper inside the narrowed field. You start making decisions that your conscious mind isn't quite tracking, running on a layer of cognition that's older and faster and doesn't use words. I watched Voss operate in that state for 2 hours and 19 minutes. She moved through it the way you move through a house you've lived in for 20 years in the dark. No hesitation, no performed calm. Just the absolute bone-deep familiarity of someone who'd been here. Not this mountain, not this fight, but here. Yet in the place where everything is reduced to its barest function, so many times that it had become her native country. Holbrook got Martinez stable, improvised tourniquet, bootlace, the kind of solution that shouldn't work, and does. And I watched Holbrook's hands shake so hard he almost lost the knot twice, and I watched him get it on the third try through some combination of stubbornness and rage and the specific grace of a person refusing to let something be true. Voss, passing behind him, put one hand on the back of his neck for exactly 3 seconds. Didn't stop moving. Didn't say anything. Holbrook's hands steadied. I wrote it down, and then I stared at what I'd written for a long time because I didn't know what to do with it. It was too small to be significant and too significant to be small. The egress was Voss's. Dill presented the route, north along the ridgeline, which was faster and more exposed, and Voss said nothing for long enough that the silence itself became a position. Then she said, "We're going down." Down was longer. Down was worse terrain in the dark. Down left us below the ridgeline for 400 meters with limited sight lines and no good cover if we caught contact again. Down was also the direction they wouldn't expect, because no competent unit chooses down when they're already below their extraction point. And the men shooting at us had been positioning all night for north. It was a gamble dressed as geography. Dill knew it. I could see him running the math. The career math, not the tactical math, calculating what it costs to be wrong, calculating what it costs to be right, but to have been overridden, calculating what it costs to defer and whether the cost of deferring to her in front of these men was more than he could afford. He deferred. We went down. We made it. Entry 147. Final notation. Egress successful. Voss route. Time 0517. Martinez evacuated. No additional casualties. I wrote it, and I closed the log, and I sat in the back of the vehicle listening to the particular sound of men breathing when they are not yet sure they are allowed to believe it's over, and I thought about the face Dill had made when Voss walked in. The calculating face. The I don't know how to play this hand face. And I thought about what it must be like. 30 years of it. 30 years of walking into rooms and having your competence treated as an open question, while men with less of it were extended the professional courtesy of being assumed capable until proven otherwise. 30 years of doing the work twice, once the work itself, and once the constant labor of making people see the work. I didn't ask her about it. She wasn't someone you asked things like that to, not because she'd shut it down, but because the question would have required her to perform a kind of vulnerability that she'd long since decided wasn't the point. The work was the point. The body count of correct decisions was the point. The mountain knew what it was. She didn't need it confirmed. 3 days later, a resupply run brought a new embed from division staff. 26, squared jaw, brand new combat patch, the shiny confidence of someone who hasn't yet made a mistake large enough to dent him. But he looked at Voss across the fire base. He leaned over to me and said, quiet, the way men say things when they want deniability. "What's the deal with the old lady?" I looked at him. I thought about 112 and 147 in Holbrook's hands and the mountain at 0300 and the way she turned away from the sound. I said, "Write it down when you figure it out." He didn't know what that meant. That was fine. Some things take time to understand. There's some things you only understand after you've been wrong enough times in the dark that being right stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like the only thing you owe. She was in the corner of the fire base, sharpening a blade she'd been carrying since before this kid was born, not looking up, not waiting for anything, and the mountain outside the wire was quiet for the first time in 9 days, and I wrote down the time, and I wrote down the quiet, and I left a line blank after it, for what came next. There was always something that came next. Entry 309, stateside, October, Clarksville. Following Voss because I told Ramirez I'd deliver the after-action binder personally, and Ramirez is the only person in the command structure I'd cross a parking lot for. That's a lie. I was following her because she'd spent 6 weeks in country and landed at Campbell 2 days ago, and nobody, not Ramirez, not Division, not the aide whose job it actually was, had done the administrative processing of getting her personal weapon recertified under her civilian carry permit, and the bureaucratic oversight was so profoundly, specifically characteristic of how the institution treated her that when I found out I said nothing. Just drove. She didn't ask why I was driving. That was characteristic too. The store is called Second Amendment Solutions, which is the kind of name that either gives you confidence or makes you want to turn around, depending on who you are. It sits on Fort Campbell Boulevard between a payday loan office and a tire shop, in a strip mall that looks like it was designed by someone who gave up on aesthetics halfway through the sketch and decided function was enough. American flag decal on the glass, a handwritten sign about a Veterans Day sale that had been up since probably August. She went straight to the counter, and I hung back near the display case of tactical accessories, the kind of equipment that gets bought by men who have never used tactical accessories for their actual purpose, and I turned over a holster in my hands and watched. The kid behind the counter was, I want to be precise here, the human equivalent of a freshly laundered polo shirt. Nothing wrong with it, nothing in it either. He had the specific confidence that accumulates in men who have been the most capable person in every room they've ever entered, which tells you everything about the rooms. Voss put her card on the glass, listed what she needed. 9mm, 124 grain, 2 boxes. The way you order something you've ordered 10,000 times. The way a carpenter asks for a specific nail size. No drama, no negotiation, just the exact specification of a tool for a known task. The kid looked at her. And he looked at her hands. Still capable of the things hands are for, but 63 years of evidence living in them. And then he looked at her face, and he made a calculation. The kind of calculation that runs in about 1.3 seconds and is almost never consciously accessed and almost always catastrophically wrong. He smiled. You sure you don't need me to show you how those work, sweetheart? I've interviewed people who were present at notable events. As a corporal who was in the Humvee behind Marcus Luttrell's team when the goat herder decision was made. A logistics sergeant who was processing supply manifests in Fallujah when the second battle kicked off and spent 45 minutes thinking it was a drill. An EOD tech who cleared a school in Ramadi that had been prepped for detonation and only realized afterward that the insurgent planting it had still been inside. When I ask them what they remember most, none of them say the event. And they say the second before it, the quality of the air, the specific nothing that existed one instant before something became everything. That's what I was feeling when the kid said, sweetheart, because Voss didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't straighten, didn't do any of the things a person does when they're recalibrating for an unexpected social offense. She just continued setting her card on the glass with the same economy of motion she'd been using, as if the word had been atmospheric, then as if it had passed through her without finding purchase, which was either extraordinary self-control or the long, tired adaptation of a woman who had heard some version of that word in some version of that tone approximately 4,000 times and had stopped spending energy on it because energy was finite and the work was not. She said, 2 boxes, 124 grain. The kid blinked. He'd expected something. A reaction he could perform a response to. Embarrassment or outrage. Or the particular stiffness of a woman who wants him to know he's offended her but is too polite to say so. He'd expected to be the one holding the social temperature of the exchange. She had not offered him that. He reached for the ammunition. The bell above the door chimed. I heard the door and I looked, and I want to be accurate about what I saw. A man in a suit, mid-50s, the kind of physical bearing that you either earn or don't, who covered the distance between the door and the counter in the 8 steps it would normally take 12 and then stopped. He said, Sergeant Major Voss, and then, Ma'am, not Ms. Voss, not Eleanor, the rank, the full rank, with the ma'am after it like a load-bearing wall. The kid behind the counter had the box of ammunition in his hand. He was still holding it when his hand stopped. I recognized the CEO, Gerald Mather, 3rd Armored Division veteran, 2 tours. He ran this store himself before the franchise expanded and he moved into corporate, because his photo was on the wall behind the register, slightly crooked, in the kind of frame that costs $12. He'd been at a veterans conference 3 blocks up the street, which I knew because Ramirez had mentioned it, which was why Ramirez suggested this store specifically. Ramirez knew exactly what he was doing. Mather crossed the rest of the distance and extended his hand, and she took it, and the handshake they shared was the handshake of people who have been in the same places without necessarily being in the same places at the same time. The specific grip of 2 people who know what the grip means. He said, "I should have had someone call ahead. You shouldn't be waiting." She said, "I wasn't waiting long." She said it without looking at the kid. She didn't need to. And the kid set the ammunition on the counter. Mather looked at him. The look lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, I watched the kid reconstruct everything he'd said in the last 4 minutes, which was visible on his face the way restructuring is always visible on young faces. In the specific micro-collapse around the jaw, the eyes recalculating, at the new information being fed into the model he'd been running and producing outputs that conflicted catastrophically with what he'd already said. Sweetheart. He'd said sweetheart. To a woman who was currently being addressed by her rank by a man whose photograph hung behind his register. Mather said to Voss, not to the kid, to Voss, "Anything she needs goes on the house. Store policy for command sergeant majors. It has been since we opened." Voss said, "That's not necessary." "It's not a favor," Mather said. "It's a policy. Policies don't require your permission." Something shifted in her face. Not much. A millimeter of something in the area around her eyes. The specific, involuntary admission of a person who has spent so long having to argue for basic professional courtesies that receiving one without argument doesn't compute immediately. She took the ammunition. She said, "Thank you, Gerald." First name. And she'd earned that too. We were in the parking lot before I said anything. The October air had the specific quality of Tennessee October. Not cold yet, but committed to the idea of cold, practicing for it. The leaves on the single tree in the strip mall parking lot already making their decision. I said, "Ramirez knew he'd be there." She said, "Yes." I said, "Did you?" She thought about it. Actually considered the question rather than deflecting it, which she did sometimes, and with questions that were too small to merit deflection. "I figured someone would be," she said. "Someone always is, eventually." I turned that over. Eventually. Not immediately. Not automatically. Not as a professional courtesy extended to a woman who'd spent 31 years earning the right to buy ammunition without being spoken to like a grandmother at a shooting range. Eventually, after someone with a photograph on the wall walked in and converted the abstract into the concrete. I logged it. Not in the book. In the place I don't write things down. The place where entries sit without timestamps because they don't fit in a format that has a field for what this means. The kid was still at the register when I went back in for the receipt she'd left on the counter. He was doing something with his phone, not looking up. The particular studied vacancy of a person who would like to not exist in a specific space for a specific amount of time until the space feels safe to exist in again. I picked up the receipt. I thought about saying something. I thought about entry 112 and the 22 minutes we lost to a man with mileage and no accuracy. I thought about Holbrook's hands and the mountain at 0, 300, and 214 log entries and what they added up to and what they still couldn't carry. And I didn't say anything, because whatever I could say would be a lesson, and lessons require the student to believe they're in a classroom, and this kid was still deciding if this was a classroom or just a weird Tuesday, and I had stopped spending energy on that specific pedagogical problem sometime around entry 80. When I understood that some people don't learn from being told. Some people learn from being wrong in the dark, on a mountain. When the map stops matching the ground, and a woman whose hands look 63 years old turns away from the incoming fire before the rest of the room knows there is incoming fire. They learn it then, or they don't learn it. I took the receipt and walked out. She was leaning against the passenger door of my truck, not checking her phone, not looking at the tire shop or the payday loans or the October tree. Just standing, existing in the parking lot with the complete, unperformed patience of someone who stopped needing to look busy somewhere around the time I was still learning to drive. I handed her the receipt. She folded it once, put it in her jacket pocket. I got in the truck. She got in the truck. I started the engine, and neither of us said anything for a minute, which in some relationships is awkward, and in this one was simply what it was. Two people who'd shared a mountain and an egress route and 214 entries worth of evidence. I'm sitting in a truck outside a strip mall in Tennessee, not needing to narrate it. Then she said, "He'll be fine." I looked at her. "The kid," she said. "He's got time." I thought about whether I believed that. I thought about whether she believed it or was just done with the conversation. I pulled out of the parking lot. The tree dropped a leaf. Entry 309, final notation, 1614 hours. Depart Second Amendment Solutions. Voss recertified. Receipt obtained. The kid, unknown. And some variables don't resolve on timeline. I left the rest of the page blank. She had a briefing at 800 and I needed gas, and the boulevard stretched out ahead of us, straight and flat the way Tennessee gets when it stops being dramatic. And somewhere to the north there was another mountain with another map on another table, and eventually someone would print it wrong. She'd be there when they did. The room would make a face, and the silence would happen again. That particular, a weight-bearing silence. And she'd wait for it to finish. The way she always waited. The way you wait when you know you don't need it confirmed. The mountain already knew. It always knew.